Right. Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Boost CYAC's webinar series. My name is Jules Myer, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. Before we begin our session, a quick few housekeeping points. So for participants who are listening in French, please click on Floor at the bottom left of the screen and select French. To see and follow along with the PowerPoint presentation in English, click Presentation. It's located at the top left of the screen. To see and follow along, feel free to download the presentation in both English and French by clicking on Documents on the right. There will be a question and answer period during probably the last 5 or 10 minutes of this webinar. So as we're going through the presentation, feel free to jot down any questions you may have. You're welcome to use the messaging section of the board. And once you're at that messaging section, click on Participants, and that's the best location to enter your questions. And like I said, you can submit those questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll go through them at the end. If you are watching this webinar in a group, welcome. Please enter the number of participants in the group by clicking on Messaging and then Participants. We'd love to get a sense of how many people are watching today. And now let's dive right in. We've got an hour together, and I'm looking forward to chatting with all of you, and I'm grateful that you're here with us. So the topic of today's session is meaningful youth engagement. As I mentioned earlier, my name is Jules, and I work at Plan International Canada and as the director of their youth engagement team. So a lot of the elements that we're going to cover today are things that I've learned over time of working in this field of youth engagement, which is, gosh, I've been working with young people since I was 13 years old, but in my professional career, probably since I was around 20 years old. Working with you. So a lot of these are the experiences and learnings that I've taken away over the years of working with young people in all of their diversity. I've also included some sources on some of the things that we'll be covering today, so that if you're interested in learning more or reading up on more academic sources around this topic, then you're welcome to do so as well. All right, so for today's session, we are going to be covering 4 areas. The first one is the fundamentals of creating meaningful youth engagement. So really looking at the theoretical side of it, and then also how that manifests in real life, in reality. The second element that we're going to chat through is frameworks and principles for youth engagement. This is a helpful framework. It's a helpful framework to use as you develop your youth engagement initiatives. The third area is creating an enabling environment. So what are those key ingredients to creating a space where young people can thrive? And then the last area is one of my favorite areas, which is the safeguarding considerations. So going through different areas that you can be mindful of as you're developing youth engagement initiatives to ensure that you're creating a safer space for folks to participate. This agenda was put together in consultation with Boost, and they gave some great feedback on some of the areas that people were interested in diving deeper into. So hopefully this is something that can help to support the work that you're doing as well. And I'd encourage you during the questions and answers period to share some of your key lessons as well, because I have a sneaking suspicion there's a wealth of experience out there, and that we can all learn from one another. So for starters, what is youth engagement? Youth engagement can take so many different forms. I think one of the cleanest definitions I've found from the Act for Youth website is that youth engagement is when young people are involved in challenging actions to create positive social change in a responsible way. So like I said, this can take many different forms, whether it's through domestic programs or through councils or advisory committees or consultations. There are so many different ways to engage young people. So it is a very broad definition. But basically, I think it comes down to creating that space for young people to challenge actions to create positive social change. in the realm of youth engagement, it's always helpful, especially if you're starting up a youth engagement initiative within your organization, that you have some rationale behind that. You may come across folks who aren't as interested in creating opportunities for youth to engage in the work that you're doing. And so these are some helpful aspects that help to define the significance of engaging young people through the work that you're doing. So there's 4 of them. I won't read them out loud, mainly because I'm aware that that you have this resource in front of you. But I think some of the key takeaways, especially for that first one, a central principle of youth development, is that it's recognizing that youth engagement is an avenue for young people to take an active role in shaping their own identity. And I think that piece is really crucial to youth engagement work, is that we're recognizing that young people, that things aren't just being done to them, that these young people have agency, and that including them in initiatives that enable them to help to shape who they are and how they define themselves and how they interact and behave is so crucial for their development. The second one really speaks to that better equipped communities and leaders. It speaks to that element of being able to gain real-time feedback from young people, so that the programs or the services that you're offering to young people are responsive to their needs. And so youth engagement initiatives are a really great way to get that instant feedback from young folks, so that you can tailor the programs to meet the specific needs of the community and young people in particular. That third element of significance of youth engagement is very basic to their human right. It's a rights-based approach, really focusing on that young people deserve the right to represent their own interests, and that and demonstrating the belief that they are capable to do so as well is their fundamental right. And so that it speaks for itself. The last significance, or not the last, but one of the other primary ones, is it promotes civic engagement. The really nice thing about this one is that it recognizes that it equips youth with the skills and knowledge and belief that they are capable and have something to contribute to participate in society. And so that really prepares them as they transition into adulthood to play an active role in the community. All right, so the fundamentals of meaningful engagement. Again, I mentioned earlier that a lot of what I'm sharing today are things that I've learned over the years of running various domestic programs here in Canada. And so my hope is that I can bring to light how this can look in some of your youth engagement programs. Whether you're evolving the current programs that you run or are looking to start up brand new initiatives, hopefully this can help bring it to life. So one of the fundamentals of creating that meaningful engagement for young people is being inclusive by recognizing differences. So I have a diagram there demonstrating that notion of intersectionality. So when we speak about being inclusive, it's ensuring that the design of your youth engagement, whether it's a program, project, initiative, whatever you want to call it, that it's designed in a way that that calls people into the conversation, and that you are being mindful of all the different intersections of someone's identity. So whether that's their education background, their sexuality, their ability level, whether it's a visible or invisible ability, their age, their gender, their all these different elements that make up an individual. And I think one of my favorite learnings from one of the young people that I worked with or continue to work with, I think she was like 13 years old at the time, and we were talking about what's important about being inclusive, and she had mentioned that for her it was not treating everyone the way that she would want to be treated, but the way that they want to be treated. And I thought that was really insightful, in that ensuring that you understand who you're working with, and creating conditions for that young person to bring them their full selves to the table in a safer way. Another fundamental of meaningful engagement is that strengths-based program design. And so what I mean by that is focusing on the positive attributes that young people have and that they bring to the table and that they contribute, and just acknowledging and validating those strengths and leveraging that to shape the core of your program. So that could look like recognizing that everyone has something to teach or to coach or to share, and to learn from one another. And so leveraging what those strengths individuals have and creating a space for them to bring those forward. So if someone's really curious and wonderful at asking those powerful questions that get people thinking, then leveraging that in the design of your program. So really focusing on the strengths that people have, and not necessarily, and rather than the negative, rather than the barriers that folks are facing. Another fundamental of creating meaningful engagement is being mindful of power and privilege and the dynamic it creates. And what I mean by that is take the time as a facilitator to analyze the space you take up, and being self-aware and ensuring that you pose questions throughout the program or while you're facilitating to gauge the needs of the folks in the room. So I think one of my favorite examples is I was working with our youth advisory council, and at one point, so it was me, one other staff member, and then we had our 10 youth advisory council members, and they were ideating around, I can't remember, something to do with the future state of what their work plan would be. And I look at around the room and I realized that we were kind of spinning, that the conversation wasn't moving forward. And so I'd ask the question, like, what needs to be true in order for you to move forward? and they look at each other and they're like, I think we need time on our own. I was like, okay, time on your own, perfect. So then like myself and the other staff member, we left the room, and before we did, we said, all right, what are your goals for the next 10 minutes, or how much time do you need? And they're like, we need, 10 minutes. It's like, perfect. And I was like, okay, so when I come back in, what is the role that you need me to play? And so they were able to articulate, well, we want you to hold us accountable to our end objective. I was like, okay, perfect. So myself and the staff member left the room, and they were able to make so much progress. It was probably more than 10 minutes now that I think about it. But I think it just goes back to that understanding of, regardless of how open and understanding, or how much you believe that your title shouldn't matter in the room, it does. And same with age, same with other varying dynamics around power and privilege. So I think one of those elements of creating that meaningful engagement with young people is knowing when you're needed, and knowing when you need to give the young people space to do their thing. Because I think it demonstrates to them that your belief in them, their trust in them, and that you don't want to impede that. Another fundamental of meaningful engagement with youth is ensuring content is relevant. I think this is a big one that helps to maintain retention in youth engagement initiatives, ensuring that what you're covering is what young people in that initiative are interested in hearing, or that they're interested in, and that it has relevancy to their life. And so if you're talking about things that they can't see themselves in, then sometimes that can be very difficult to engage in. So it's being mindful of that content and how it's relevant to them. Uh, Another one that I find is very helpful is providing clarity of purpose. And what I mean by that is being really upfront and reiterating the scope of young people's role. So what I found in some youth engagement initiatives is that we bring young people to the table for the sake of having young people at the table. And that if we don't define what their role is, what success looks like, and you can do that together with young people, it doesn't necessarily have to be top down. It can also just be an opportunity to work with young people to really define what that purpose is, and then keep on coming back to it throughout the program. And also, like I mentioned earlier, is being really upfront is what's within their control of decision making and what is beyond that circle of control. Especially as you're working with various organizations, you're going to have your own mandate that's set by your organization. So being really upfront with that is important so that young people have a clear understanding that of where they're able to work within, like what those parameters are. Another fundamental of youth or meaningful youth engagement is to avoid generalizing about youth. This is a really easy trap to get into, and in terms of the language that you use, the way that the room is set up when young people come into that space, the way that even if it's an online space that you have young people congregating or gathering in, being really mindful that we're not treating youth as just one group identity where it's like that's defined by their age, because I think it goes back to that first principle that we were talking about, or fundamental rather, around that leveraging an intersectional approach. So examples of this are when you're setting up, I've been to a couple of board meetings with our youth advisors, and there's a tendency to use youth as the title of that young person. So at a board of directors meeting, you might have everyone have name tags in front of them, like on the table, little name cards, and you'll have all the adults will have their name and then their title, or maybe it's their company. And what I've seen in some settings is that for that young person who's participating, it'll be their name, or maybe instead of their name, it just says youth. And I think to signal and to demonstrate to young people that you truly want to engage them in a meaningful way, it's ensuring that you're not putting a label on them because of their age, because they're considered a young person, a youth. So instead, having that name tag, having their first name, and then asking them what title they'd like to have, and maybe it's like advisor, or maybe it's their school name, but having that dialogue with young people in that circumstance, in that scenario, is really important, so that we're not generalizing all youth as just youth, because they have more dimensions to them than their age. The other fundamental is reducing barriers for participation. So I think this manifests in many ways. So whether that's reducing transportation barriers, so ensuring they have whether they have access to public transportation, then maybe it's your organization is offsetting the cost of giving them bus tokens, or ensuring that there's an easy way for them to participate in terms of getting there. The other areas in terms of barriers are, I think a lot of it can be done before the young people participate in the actual program. So for instance, being really upfront if your space is inclusive of all gender identities. So being able to communicate to folks that your space has universal washrooms so that folks who are non-binary or trans, that they have a safe space where they can use washroom is really important. And I think sometimes that can be forgotten, that you being really intentional and upfront and communicating what the environment is going to be, whether or not it's accessible, so that if you're using a wheelchair or need added support, then whether that's going to be accessible for folks, whether that's going to be available for when they participate. So it's communicating that in advance, what barriers you're reducing, and you don't have to phrase it as barriers, but just being mindful of how you're creating that space, how you're communicating it to folks in advance, and then actually setting it up for when the young people attend, that it is has reduced as many barriers as possible for young people to participate. The other one is mechanisms to gauge progress. This one's an interesting one to reinforce that you're committed to creating a meaningful experience for young people. And so this can take shape in many different forms, whether it's through a formal evaluation process, if you're doing monitoring and evaluation, able to share back those results with young people, or actually developing the monitoring and evaluation framework with young people, and then having them take an active role in implementing it and then analyzing the data is one way of doing it. The other way is when you set out that clear purpose together of what your objective is for your youth engagement program, is what are those key milestones that we know that we're on the right track. So being able to set that up together at the forefront of your youth engagement work is going to be very helpful to retain the attention and the involvement of young people. And the other fundamental is that celebrate and recognize accomplishments. I think that's a really important one. And when I talk about celebrating and recognizing those accomplishments, it's being sure that you're specific with it. And I know you probably hear this a lot, but it's ensuring that feedback that you're giving to people is meaningful. So, for instance, since I was saying like, hey, way to go, great job, it's, hey, I really liked how you brought the group together, explained the next activity, and got them all engaged. Like it's recognizing the small things that they're doing. Or, hey, I saw that you went up to so-and-so when they were sitting off to themselves and sat down and started to chat with them. Like, that was really cool of you. So being really specific and recognizing not only the large accomplishments that young people are having, but also those small things that make the program even stronger, that are really based on their character. Okay, so this screen is a little unwieldy, I realize. There's a lot going on. However, I wanted to share this framework with you, and I believe there's 3 slides on this. So you're welcome to use this as a reference point as you're designing or evolving your youth engagement programs. But I thought this was a helpful one because this is a framework that Gerard Dekort has created, and it's helpful in that it's so detailed and it breaks it out in a really nice way on the principles of youth participation. So he actually wrote a summary of policy and concepts around youth participation for the United Nations, and this is a really useful sociological framework to help guide the work that you're doing around meaningful youth engagement. And you can also use this to assess the efficacy of your youth engagement work. Basically, across the top row, that lists out the levels of participation of young people. So it goes from non-participation all the way to the highest level of youth engagement, which is self-mobilization. And then on the left-hand side of this chart, there are, I believe there's 9 organizational areas. So these are areas that your organization most likely works in. So for instance, analyzing needs and setting objectives, information and communication, decision making. These are the various areas that an organization works within to implement the work that they're doing. And I find this as a really helpful tool because for me, I find that one isn't necessarily better than the other in terms of the youth engagement level. And what I mean by that is I think what I found is it's really helpful to have conversations with the young people that you're working with on a particular project to better understand where they see themselves fitting in. So for instance, one project that we're working with on with our youth engagement council, we're working on our strategic direction, and so we chatted with them in terms of what type of role they wanted to play, whether it was they wanted to create it for us, like for the organization, or if they wanted to be consulted or they wanted to help. And that would be through that influencing field, or whether they wanted to co-create it in partnership. So various programs will, or projects rather, will work with our Youth Advisory Council to understand basically their capacity in terms of time, where their interests lie, and where they feel they are best suited to support that particular project. And in some cases, you're going to get the response of, I want you to create whatever the project is or whatever the ask is, and then we want to vet it afterwards and make sure that it's in line with what we think will be suitable. And that's okay. So I think the idea is that being mindful of their different levels of participation and understanding the needs of the young people that you're working with to actually bring that to life is really crucial. And this particular grid of engagement helps to frame that. So I'll go to the next one. This is more of the same grid. And I think there's some interesting ones here, and that it calls out the one of the organizational areas of administration. And so it's looking at ways that young people can be a part of that administration piece, and whether or not there's appetite from the young people that you work with, and then also your organization to get them more involved in that element. So it's all the different elements of your organization. And this is the last slide of that grid of engagement. And one of the interesting ones that we talked about, monitoring and evaluation. One that we haven't discussed yet is that realm of employees. So looking at ways that you can engage young people as employees to run the programming too. One example of that is we were in the process of developing cyber safety guidelines and tips, both for young people and then also folks who are supporting young people. And we had proposed this project to our Youth Advisory Council, and they were really excited by it, and had proposed that they wanted to be the ones who were leading the charge on that, which was really exciting. So because this was a project that could be parsed off on its own, and there was one individual in particular who was very keen to take this project on, we were in a position to actually hire that young person to deliver and to create the cyber safety guidelines, and she did a fantastic job with it. So that's an example of self-mobilization and providing an opportunity for a young person to be compensated for their contributions to the work that you're doing. Okay, we're going to switch gears here a little bit and talk about creating that enabling environment. I think in order to create that enabling environment, there are lots of key ingredients to it. I think the two that stand out the most to me is that promoting agency and decision making and creating that space for them to do it, to apply their learnings, and to do it in a way where they can learn. And so what I mean by that is that they can be successful, that they can fail, that they can learn from that they can try new things, that they can take risks in a space that that they are going to be supported, fully supported by not only the staff members, but also their peers. So a really big element is that creating that space for young people to take the lead. And I think that goes back to recognizing that using that strengths-based approach, and that young people have so much to offer. And so creating that space for young people to not only lead their peers, but then also help lead the staff member that you have on board. So facilitating workshops, or leading a conversation, or leading the ground rules session. Creating that, like actively carving out that space for them to lead in various capacities is crucial for creating that space for them to practice their skill sets. Another one, and I combine it into that next one, creating that safe space for youth to try, fail, and succeed is so crucial, because 90% of the way you perceive yourself is defined by the age of 18 years old. And that's defined based on your experiences through success, through failure, through trying things. And so if our role as working with young people is helping to create that environment for them to experience those elements. Another key thing about creating that enabling environment for young people to take the lead is to actively learn from all youth and observe their behaviors. So what I mean by that is being inquisitive and being curious, and taking the time to learn from them in terms of asking questions, but then like in a curious manner, but also observation. So I find it really helpful to sometimes just take a step back and look at the interactions, the behaviors, the way people are carrying themselves, can help to inform the way that you design your programs, so that they are more responsive to the needs of young people. Another part that's really important is accountability and transparency. So what I mean by that is I'm really focusing about how young people's ideas are being considered and implemented. So it goes back to being really specific around the purpose of your youth engagement work, and taking time to hear what young people have to say, and then being really transparent around that decision-making process, which we talked about earlier. The other thing that I find enormously helpful is preparing young people. So taking the time to ensure that they have what they need in terms of knowledge, skills, confidence, and support systems in place, so that they can take on that leadership role, or doing something that asks them to step outside of their comfort zone. So a great example of that is whenever we have an opportunity for a young person to sit on a panel discussion at a conference, whether it's a global conference or national conference or local one, lots of time is taken to better understand the needs of that individual, in terms of the skills, knowledge, and psychosocial support space for them, or support rather, and ensuring that they have what they need in order to feel successful and to be successful. So going back to a strengths-based approach, I'd be mindful of what things can you as a staff support person offer, and what are things that some of the peers of that young individual have to offer. So if a young person, perhaps an alumni or someone who has, in the same example of the panel discussion, if they have had experience of being on a panel, partnering them with the person who is about to do the same thing can be enormously helpful, so that they have that peer-to-peer learning that happens. And it also enables that young person, if they can see themselves in that role through their peer, it also helps to build that sense of, I can do this. So preparing youth is really important. And I think the other piece to ensure that you're doing it in a very meaningful and intentional way is helping them to craft their messages, what they want the audience to hear from them, and creating that space to practice it is really important, as opposed to providing the opportunity and then hoping for the best. That can be a really unnerving situation for a young person. So ensuring that they are prepared is most welcome. Another one, this is my favorite one, is show up. That's huge. Especially working with young people who might have experienced some form of trauma, or a lot of inconsistencies in terms of support from adults in their life. As a person, as a staff member who works with young people, it's really important that you have staff members who continually show up for that individual. And it's not just physically being there, that's a big part of it, but it's also being present, so that when you're with that young person, you're not on your phone all the time, or you're not looking for who else is in the room that you can network with. It's you are there to be with that person and show up for them. They'll feel that, and it goes a long way to creating that enabling environment for them to build the courage to be an agent of change. The other one is adequate resourcing. And what I mean by that is, when you are designing any sort of youth engagement initiative, being really mindful about the budget that's required and the resources that's required to implement that successfully. So it's, I think, in terms of the budget, looking at what are the budget that you're going to require to reduce barriers of participation. That's a big part of it. What are the budget required to ensure that you're safeguarding, you have proper safeguarding measures in place, is also crucial. And then also the staff support to run it, so that you have dedicated people who can help to support the youth engagement work that you're doing, and that it gets the time and attention that it deserves, so that these young people are set up for success. The other piece in terms of an enabling environment, and this is more of a mechanism to determine the success of creating that enabling environment, is tracking retention. It can be a really good indicator if you have young people who are returning, either to participate again in another project or in the same project, or also looking at retention in terms of, if you develop mentorship programs, are the participants interested in continuing on to help mentor and coach the next cohort, the next generation. So tracking retention can be a nice indicator on how you're doing and creating that enabling environment where young people can be successful and want to continue to be a part of the youth engagement work that you're doing. Then I think that also is a nice segue to create growth opportunities. And one of the really nice things is that if you can design your youth engagement work to continue to grow as the young people in your initiative continue to grow by creating, like I said, the mentorship opportunities or the opportunities to teach their peers or the opportunities to lead the dialogue or organize the gatherings. What are those incremental growth opportunities that you can infuse into your program so that so that they continue to progress and continue to grow with it? That's really important to creating that environment that's going to enable these young people to take on more decision-making roles and leadership roles. Okay, this is my favorite part. All around the safeguarding considerations. I've broken it up into two areas. One's the planning stage, and then the other one is the implementation. So we'll start with the planning stage. As people who work with children or young people, do no harm will come as no surprise. And the idea behind that is being really mindful and intentional to understand what are the risks associated with the youth engagement work that you're doing, and how to mitigate them. Also, if there are things that you're planning that the risks are just too great and can't be mitigated, then it's also asking yourself and having the organization ask themselves, is this the right direction? So one example of this that brings it to life is that working in an international context, or even in a domestic context, is that if you are bringing young people to advocate for change at a national or global platform, it's understanding all elements of their participation and the risks involved in it. So for instance, it could be as basic as the logistical side, but then it becomes more complex around the psychological safety element. So if you have a young person who is all of a sudden being transplanted into an environment where you have world economic leaders there, or world leaders rather, in the room, and then you're putting them back or they're returning to their community but don't necessarily have the psychosocial supports to re-engage, for them to re-engage into their community, especially if communities may not be as excited or as welcoming for that young person to be in that environment. You have to be really mindful about the impact that has on the young person, and so ensuring that you are creating a space that's safe for them to participate. Which brings me to the next one, which is that mindset. And so when we think of safeguarding, oftentimes we're looking at it from that safe from point of view, like we're keeping them safe from harm. And what I'd encourage is that mindset of like creating that environment and space for them to be safe to participate or safe to enact change. And I should distinguish between the two. So that safeguarding are those, what are the elements that you're putting in place for people to be safe to participate? Whereas looking at protection of children, you're really looking at that, keeping them safe from. And it's more in the moment, and it's looking at the rights of the child and protecting those rights and creating programs that are specifically around child protection. Safeguarding needs to be infused into everything that you do with working with young people. And so these are the considerations that you would take into account, like the do no harm, that mindset that you have. Another one is the conducting a robust risk assessment that leverages an intersectional approach. So really looking at everything from the design phase to the implementation phase to that closing phase of what are the risks associated with those areas. Another safeguarding area, or consideration rather, is to integrate strategies and plans for addressing those risks. So it's part of that risk assessment, and looking at if that issue should arise that you've defined in your risk assessment, what are the strategies and plans that you would put into place to mitigate it if it does happen. So some helpful things to do, and I'm jumping ahead here, is that community mapping. So it's looking at what are the external protection and support services and resources. And a lot of you might actually work for organizations that provide that. But having a clear picture of, so for instance, if you are working on a youth engagement initiative and it takes you outside of the city or the town or the community that you are familiar with, then doing that community mapping to understand where are the hospitals, what is the like crisis support lines that you can reach out to for the demographic that you're working with. So helping to map that out and include that in your strategies is going to be really helpful. And then I had mentioned this earlier, but it's worth mentioning again, is include safeguarding considerations into the budget so that if, for instance, one of your safeguarding measures is that you have a minor who is traveling on an airplane to go somewhere, or it needs to take public transportation but isn't necessarily comfortable with doing that on their own, include the budget so that you can have a support person join them. Same with if you're hosting a gathering and you know that, sensitive information will be shared, or it could be an environment that triggers the participants based on the content that you're going through. Then budget for that psychosocial support worker, and being mindful that it can't be the person who's facilitating, because if a young person needs that additional support, the facilitator has a responsibility of looking after the folks in the room. And so having that additional support that you budgeted for to support that person who might be experiencing or in a state of crisis, then it's enormously helpful to be able to have someone there to support. And not only helpful, but it's the right thing to do. It's to ensure that we're doing no harm with any of the youth engagement work. So leverage your budget, build it in. In terms of implementation and safeguarding consideration, I think a really important aspect is normalizing reaching out for support. So if that's built into the regular conversations and just the way that you run your youth engagement work, is going to help to destigmatize that notion of reaching out for support as being seen as a negative thing. And also being really upfront and open around like the types of supports that are out there for people, how to access that support, what that support will, the impact or what it's designed to do, and having those as part of the conversations throughout all your programming will go a long way in creating that safer space that that encourages young people to be self-aware and reflect on what are their needs that they have right now, and that it's okay to ask for help is really important. Public engagement safeguards. So yes, what I mean by this is through your youth engagement work, you may want to engage young people to help advocate for the work that you folks are doing together. And so that might take the form of them going on a news network and speaking, or speaking to a local media outlet like a newspaper, or doing a vlog or a blog, or tweeting out things, or leveraging their Instagram accounts to advocate for change. When you're engaging young people in that public facing work, it's really crucial to ensure that you're informing young people about the safety elements of it. So by sharing your last name or location that you live or the school that you attend, especially if you're under the age of 16, it could open up young people to more risks and to have members of the community or broader community reach out to that young person and engage them in a way that is not safe. So an example of this is we have for instance, on Twitter, young people, when they're engaging in Twitter, and if they post things that share more details around where they live, it becomes increasingly easy for strangers or people that don't know them to locate them and to engage them in a way that they don't feel comfortable, or that young person doesn't feel comfortable. So, for instance, on Twitter, anonymity is it's a huge part of that, and that you can have people who are setting up fake Twitter accounts and then directly messaging your young person and luring them into something that they may not want to be a part of. So it's educating young people around the safety elements of it, and then also supporting them in the best way possible. And sometimes, if it is a very public-facing thing, encouraging young people to set up a separate account that would be their public-facing one. And that if they wish, they can have your organization help to manage that account throughout the campaign that's being run. Would be one example of how you can safeguard that young person. Another area is understanding the informal and formal rules and patterns of violence within each community. So as you're doing the safeguarding assessments, it's understanding the nuances within each community, whether it's informal rules or formal rules that are set up by through religion or through just the societal norms. Understanding what that looks like in the community that you're working with is going to be really crucial to being informed as you set up the design of your youth engagement work and to mitigate any risks associated with it. So for instance, especially if you're addressing harmful gender social norms in a community, it's understanding the impact that will have on that individual's life as they continue to engage with their community. So it's mitigating the risks on that. Another area is build safeguarding indicators into your program design to monitor and evaluate. I really like this one because it helps to make it more tangible for people who are working with young people to, as you're setting out your key performance indicators for the work that you're doing, if you build in indicators about safeguarding, it helps to ensure that safeguarding is never an afterthought and that it's intrinsic to how you design and implement the youth engagement work. And then the last one is to ensure facilitators and staff receive safeguarding training. So taking the time to prepare the staff members who are working with young people so that they are equipped to create safer spaces for young people to participate in youth engagement work. And I believe that is the end of all the content that I put together. So I will open it up for questions or comments or things that you'd like to share from your experience. Love to learn from you folks as well. We're just checking to see if there's any questions. Okay. We're going to wait a couple of seconds here. You might have questions around the safeguarding element or any design questions around a program that you're thinking of starting up, or looking for buy-in from your organization to have youth engagement work done. So all questions are welcome, and also some of your experiences on what are some of the critical things that you found to be helpful for engaging young people in a meaningful way. We'd love to hear from you. And also, if you share a question, then we'll just read out the question and keep your name anonymous. We'll give you a couple more minutes to think through any questions or comments or things that you'd like to share. And again, the way to share your questions is if you click on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a messaging circle. And so you can click on the messaging circle and then you'll see text that says participants. So click on that and then you can write any questions you have. So we had one comment and just saying, thanks for the presentation. Many aspects I had not thought about and now will. Thank you for sharing that. It feels good. It's good to hear. Okay. I realize that we did cover a lot of material in this past hour. So if you do have any questions that pop up, or when you're walking home from work or wherever you are and you think, I should have asked this one question, then please feel free to email Pearl at Boost, and she'll be, we work in the same office building, so she can contact me, and I'm happy to respond to any questions that may come up later. One participant of this group has shared that they have experiences facilitating as well, and has suggested that we share these slides out to get more buy-in and accept the role that young people, like the critical role that young people can play. So if you go to presentations, you're able, so on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a button that says presentations, and you're able to download both the French and English version of this presentation. If you click on, so you go to presentation and then click on documents, and then you can download the French and English versions. And then I can share them with anyone. And you're welcome to share them with whomever you want. I understand there's more than 20 folks who've been watching, so thank you for staying with us and joining us. It's been a pleasure to share a little bit of what I've learned over the past 15 years, so thank you. Have a great day, everyone.